Alright, what is up YouTube? It is GarsJM99 again, doing another creepypasta read. Alright, this one is Gateway of the Mind. In 1983, a team of deeply pious scientists conducted a radical experiment in an undisclosed facility. Scientists has theorized that a human without access to any senses or any ways to perceive stimuli would be able to perceive the presence of God. They believe that the five senses clouded our awareness of eternity, and without them, a human could actually establish contact with God by thought. An elderly man who claimed to have nothing left to live for was the only test subject to volunteer. To purge him of all of his senses, the scientists performed a complex operation in which every sensory nerve connection to the brain was surgically severed. Although the test subject retained full muscular function, he cannot see, hear, taste, smell, or feel, with no possible way to communicate with or even sense the outside world. He was alone with his thoughts. Scientists monitored him as he spoke aloud, his state of mind jumbled, slurred sentences that he couldn't even hear. After 4 days, the man claimed to be hearing hushed, unintelligible voices in his head. Assuming it was an onset of psychosis, the scientists paid little attention to the man's concerns. 2 days later, the man cried. All he could hear was his dead wife speaking to him. And even more, he could communicate back. Scientists were intrigued, but none were convinced until the subject started naming dead relatives of the scientist. He repeated personal information to the scientists that only their dead spouses and parents would have known. At this point, a sizable portion of the scientists left the study. After a week of conserving the deceased through his thoughts, the subject became distressed, saying voices were overwhelming. In every waking moment, his consciousness was bombarded by hundreds of voices that refused to leave him alone. He frequently threw himself against a wall, trying to elicit a pain response. He begged the scientists for sedatives, so he could escape the voices by sleeping. The tactic worked for 3 days, until he started having severe night terrors. The subject repeatedly said that he could see and hear the deceased in his dreams. Only a day later, the subject began to scream and claw at his non-functional eyes, hoping to sense something in the physical world. The hysterical subject now said the voices of the dead were deafening and hostile, speaking of hell and the end of the world. At one point he yelled, "No heaven, no forgiveness," for 5 hours straight. He continually begged to be killed, but the scientists were convinced that he was close to establishing contact with God. After another day, the subject could no longer coherent sentences. Seemingly mad, he started to bite off chunks of his flesh from his own arm. The scientists rushed down to the test chamber. and restrained him to a table so that he could not kill himself. After a few hours of being tied down, the subject halted, his struggling and screaming. He stared blankly at the ceiling as teardrops silently streaked across his face. For 2 weeks, the subject had to be manually rehydrated due to his constant crying. Eventually, he turned his head, and despite his blindness, he made focus with eye contact with the scientist for the first time in the study. He whispered, "I have spoken with God, and He has abandoned us." And his vital signs stopped. There is no apparent cause of death. Alright, so what did I think of that creepypasta? It's actually pretty strange of how the scientists would theorize that and how it would become true. But yeah, what he said, I'm pretty sure isn't true. The God has abandoned us and all that. Yeah, I don't think that's true. And I found a real video. It's, what's his name? Yeah, Oliver de Sagazar. And there's this video called Performance Oliver de Sagazar 2008. And here is footage of the video.
Ah!